What you're about to watch is a conversation that I had yesterday with Rick Sammon about creating images with impact. We recorded this for our different podcasts. Mine is the Landscape Photography Podcast. His is Picturing Success, and you can find both of those over on iTunes. But anyways, we recorded the whole thing. I thought you guys might enjoy it. So sit back, relax, and hopefully enjoy this conversation that I had with Rick Sammon. So this will be fun, sitting down with the Godfather, Rick Sammon.
Well, listen, you can't do better than being on the Oregon coast with Nick Page. I mean, you're an amazing photographer. It's so much fun to see you again.
Well, it's good to hang out with you, Rick. So we're recording this for both of our podcasts. Those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Nick Page from the Landscape Photography Podcast, and I'm sitting down with Rick Sammon for your podcast.
Yeah, the Picturing Success Podcast, but the Landscape Photography Podcast. For those listeners out there, for the Picturing Success Podcast, you got to check out this podcast. He just gave a presentation. We're recording this on the Oregon coast. He just gave a presentation that blew our audience away. You know, your focus stacking, your exposure, your composition, just amazing. You're a wonderful. Actually, Alex Morley, our good friend who's actually doing the recording here, he introduced you, and then I added something on after all of the accolades. I said, you're a great dad. And I think that's really important.
Well, you are far too kind, Rick. I appreciate that. So one of the things that I was talking about in my talk with your group was creating images with impact and trying to figure out what it is that creates an image that has that initial wow factor when somebody views it. And I think most people, even Rick in the very beginning, when he first started taking photos, you notice that it just doesn't do the scene justice. It just doesn't have that impact that grabs the viewer. So Rick, what advice do you have for people that are noticing that their images just lack that initial impact?
Well, I think looking at your pictures is very, very important, and critiquing yourself. But the thing that stood out when you were giving all this list of, what makes an image with impact, like a slow shutter speed, like a fast shutter speed, like color, like tremendous depth of field, it was that emotion. And, emotion when it comes to photographing a person, you could see if the picture conveys emotion or not. But also even a landscape can convey emotion. And you were talking about, which I really like, that the mood and the feeling, like how important the weather is, watching the weather. Go out in bad weather when it's stormy and cloudy and lightning. And those kind of pictures can often have, much more emotion than when you go down to like the gift shops here and you look at the postcards where it's sunny and beautiful, like in every shot.
Yeah, and it's not always super obvious what even creates an image that has some form of emotion or moodiness. You hear the term moodiness, and nobody ever really takes the time to explain what that means. So I guess when I think of a moody image, a lot of times a moody image is a slightly darker image where there's lots of contrast, there's lots of darker tones in the shot. But it's also an image that maybe doesn't rely heavily on saturation. It's more of a composition-based composition. A dark shot with a really strong composition oftentimes has that initial moody feeling to it.
And I also think I love some of your pictures there that had deep shadows. With HDR today, so many people say, oh, I could open up all the shadows. I could do all this, blending modes and everything. They open up the shadows, and that destroys the mood often. Shadows are, one of my favorite expressions is shadows are the soul of the photograph. Yeah. And I love, you have a shot, forget where it's taken, where the left-hand side, you have these beautiful dark shadows. And that creates a sense of mystery. And another expression that I like is, I think it goes something like, when you take the mystery out of the photograph, you destroy the photograph. So having that sense of mystery, I think, is so important. You just don't want that flat shot.
One of the best ways to lead a viewer through a photo is with highlights. That the highlights of your photo are what's going to be drawing the eye of the viewer through your frame. And you have to be smart about where you have them. If you just have detail and shadow detail everywhere in your photo, the eye is just going to bounce around all over in the photo. And when the eye does that, it's not generally a very successful shot because there isn't that visual path. So a visual path is often created through highlights, and those highlights are not going to have impact if there's not deep shadows. So there has to be both deep shadows, which repel the eye, and those highlights to kind of draw the eye through the frame, I think.
So another one, light illuminates, shadows define. And I think when I'm teaching photography, when you're teaching photography, what I'm saying is let's look for those highlights. Let's look for the shadows. I think when we talk about any type of photography, we have to learn how to see the light. And in seeing the light, I think the most important thing is seeing the contrast range in the scene, because sometimes the picture's not there, right? So seeing the contrast range of the scene and then envisioning the end result, see how we can control those highlights and shadows in Photoshop, Lightroom, or wherever, right? So the contrast range is important. The brightness level is important, so we know where to set our ISO. The color of light is very, very important. You were demonstrating, you were flipping through your new camera there, doing the different white balances. And the color definitely affects the mood of the scene, which actually is different in different cultures. Like yellow means something to, in one culture might mean something different in another color, and blue and so forth. So I think if your audience is in a certain culture, you might want to think about how that color is going to affect the mood of the scene and the feeling of the photograph.
Yeah, it's kind of a tangent a little bit, but we've both been to China. And one of the things that they teach you about the culture in China is you never show a black and white photo of somebody to themselves, because the culture, at least the way I understand it in China, is that black and white photos are reserved for ancestors and for their family members that have passed on. So when you show a black and white photo of someone to themselves, it's like them seeing their own ghost. So it's kind of funny. I don't know if you experienced that.
Yeah. Andy and Mia Beals, right? Our guys over there, and just wonderful, wonderful people.
Amazing people.
But so you're talking about respecting the subject, right? But this also comes to landscape photography. The environment that you're in, and also the animals. Doesn't it drive you crazy when you see people like trashing? Well, I'm sure they don't do it on your workshops, but you see it, people trashing through the environment or getting too close to the animals, harassing the animals. So
absolutely.
I think in photography, respecting the subject, whatever it is very, very important.
And I don't know if you've noticed this, Rick, but it seems recent, but with the gradual incline of the popularity of just outdoor activities in general, there's more people going outdoors than there ever has been before. And there's just so many people going to these beautiful locations. And the more humans you get into a location, the worse that location is going to be. And
the more selfie sticks you have.
Yes.
Right?
Well, and garbage and just the damage that comes from traffic. It's been something that I've noticed a lot in the Pacific Northwest.
So if someone said to you, Nick Page, the world famous Nick Page, if you could only give one landscape photography tip, what would that landscape photography tip be?
To be, I guess, a student of the weather. I think the weather is the most impactful thing that's going to impact your photo. The most impactful external influence that's going to impact your photo. So being a student of the weather and making time to do photography when the weather is optimal for it. The person that can only get out when the weather is not optimal, unfortunately, is not going to come away with as interesting of photos as the person that makes the time and studies the weather and gets out there when the weather is doing something really interesting. So I think my number one tip is to be a student of the weather and to go out when the light is going to do something interesting.
So can you tell our listeners some of the apps that you use? Because our members here really love these apps that you were using.
For just basic general weather, the general standard weather, I use WeatherBug. And the reason I use WeatherBug is it's simple, but it's also fairly full featured, where you can, look at different radar maps and cloud cover maps and all the different basic things that you need. But it also has a really good lightning tracking feature called Spark, where you can see exactly, in the entire country where all the lightning is falling. And that's useful. Another one that I really like is Weather Underground and Weather Underground Storm. I think they've changed it to like Storm Tracker, but it's basically called Storm. And it's just a really intuitive app where you can see not only predictions for cloud cover and radar cover and all of that stuff, but it's just really detailed with a lot of different information. Another one that I've just started using, I use a lot of them. Another one I've just started using that I really like is called Clear Outside. And the reason I like that is because it gives you a cloud cover prediction as far as the percentage of clouds. But not only that, but the different levels of clouds, so high, medium, and low clouds, along with a whole bunch of other meteorological stuff that is over Nick's head. But what's useful about that is the different levels of clouds greatly dictate the type of sunset you could potentially get. High clouds are always going to be the color catching clouds where they're way up high. They're going to catch those reds and pinks and magentas. The medium clouds can be the more boofy. That's a great term. The more you associate them with either puffy clouds or like storm clouds, those are going to be the medium level. And low clouds are typically going to be like the light blocking clouds when it's really overcast, it's raining. So knowing those three different things, super, super useful.
Cool. When you review portfolios, you do this on your workshops, right? At the end of I'm sure you have like a group slideshow. Is there anything that drives you crazy? For me, basically if the horizon line is tilted, that's one. Also blown out highlights. I really try not to blow out highlights. Sometimes when I'm shooting into the sun, that does happen, but I'm really careful about that. Is there anything when you critique a landscape photograph that says, I can't believe this person didn't think of that, or something I really wish that person had thought of that?
Typically, my biggest critique is just not getting close enough to the main point of the photo. Like there's always a reason you took a photo. You stand on this seascape and you're loving, the way the water is interacting with the rocks or whatever it is. Maybe there's a sea star and it's on that rock. But the biggest problem or the biggest mistake that I see oftentimes is people just don't get close enough to the interesting subject. So if you do have that sea star, if it's a tiny little, orange dot in your frame, it's not going to be very impactful to the frame. But if you get right up close to it and make it large and obvious that that's why you took the photo in the first place, it's going to make for a more successful photo, I think. So usually it's just not getting close enough or not filling the frame enough with the reason you took the photo in the first place.
If you think you're close, get closer. Another way to put that, I think, is cut the clutter.
Yeah, absolutely.
That you had a wonderful picture taken in a forest, and you gave everyone some good advice today. You said you want to challenge yourself, go into a forest, where it's like a compositional mess, and try to make great composition there. I think that's very, very important. But I think cutting the clutter. When I see landscape photos too, there's just too much clutter. You have to have a main subject. It could be that little starfish that you're speaking about.
Yeah. Anytime that you're able to simplify the scene down to only what is helping the story, that is only going to be a good thing. And sometimes you can take that to just extreme levels where, like, the photo I shared from the painted hills in Oregon, typically you see all of the painted hills with the sky, but by filling the frame with just one painted hill and no sky and nothing else to distract the viewer, it gives that just initial impact because there is literally nothing else to look at in that photo but the reason I took the photo in the first place. And showing people something that they don't often see oftentimes makes for a more interesting photo. Because, nothing is more boring than looking at a photo of something that you see absolutely every day. So the more rare the subject is that you're looking at in a photo, it makes it more interesting, I think.
Well, speaking of that, do you know Jay Maisel?
I don't
know of him. He's Alex Morley, our friend, who's our videographer right now, who's co-leading the workshop with me. He took a workshop from Jay Maisel in New York City. And when Jay reviews pictures, he's a little harsh on people. And so I'm going to have to tone it down for your listeners and our listeners. I'm going to tone it down a lot, and our listeners who know Jay know what I'm speaking about. But when he looks at a picture, he'll ask you, again, I'm toning it down, why the heck should I care about that picture? But this is actually a really good question, because if you're going to show Jay Maisel or someone like yourself a picture, you should ask, I think, yourself, why should the person I'm showing it to you care? Yeah. So I think what you're saying is by getting closer, you want someone to care about what's in the photograph. So caring, I think, is really important. And when you're looking through your pictures, okay, maybe no one's going to care about this picture. It might be sentimental to you. You mentioned that your mom passed away when you were on a workshop, and we're sorry for that. But, those pictures that you took were a reflection of your mood in there. Yeah. I think it showed that you really cared about making those pictures.
And I think that's kind of a relevant subject, given just the kind of the state of social media these days, and it's something that something that I talk about fairly often on the show is, social media, unfortunately, can be very look at me driven, and people are doing things for the sake of getting more likes. And they're not always doing things that really speak to them. They're doing things that they, unfortunately, know that they'll get a lot of likes or, a lot of shares or whatever it is. And they're not necessarily doing the type of photography that speaks to them. They're doing the type of photography that could potentially, get the word out about them and their photography a little bit more. So I feel like it's a relevant topic, and I don't know that everybody is shooting entirely for what they're passionate about. And I encourage people to do that. Shoot what you're passionate about, because if you're not passionate about it, you're going to get burnt out, and you're going to get burnt out quickly. So if you want to have longevity, find what it is that you're passionate about and do that. And that's the best way to really have your own unique voice, I think, in photography.
I think you're right. Too many people, like, even I publish sunset pictures, right? I publish one from here. It gets tons of likes. If I'm in a Buddhist temple in Myanmar with candles around a Buddhist monk, not that many likes. But that type of picture is so important to me. Right. So the social media thing, I think you're 100% right. And people are bragging, they get like 1 million followers. Oh, I got 1 million followers. Now, to get sponsors, that's important. Which is a whole nother thing. I'm sure you see it, that the sponsors are interested in someone who has a lot of likes. It doesn't matter whether they're good or not.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, we live in the period of, rather than being good photographers, we're called influencers.
Right, exactly.
Because we have Instagram and Instagram stories and stuff. It's interesting. It's a new set of problems, I guess you could say, for this particular time period we're in. We'll watch this video of ourselves in 10 years and be laughing because it'll feel so dated, because Instagram might not even exist in 10 years. Maybe. And we'll have a totally different set of problems. But it's not something that you probably had, 20 years ago. That wasn't the problem.
Well, 30 years ago when I was shooting film. Now, Nick Page has never shot film.
Never.
I grew up shooting slide film, actually print film, negative film, and then slide film. Now, you're so lucky, because with slide film, when you're shooting slide film, you had to be right on.
Yeah.
What's the exposure latitude now? It's just amazing what we could pull out of the shadows, pull out of the shadows and tone down in the highlights. But when I shoot digital, I shoot it like I'm shooting slide film. I'm exposing for the highlights. Mm-hmm. I'm moving that histogram over to the right to the point where I might get a blinky and then move it back. It's tempting with these new cameras with the big screens to look at just the picture. But I don't know about you, but I always shoot with the histogram on and the highlight alert activated, because, the screen doesn't really tell you.
The highlights, a blown highlight is like the only thing that you can't correct for later on. Like, once a highlight is gone, It's gone forever. And especially with modern cameras nowadays that are ISO invariant and all these crazy things, you can get away with underexposing so much more than ever before. Especially now that I've switched to the Sony camera that I'm shooting. That thing is just a beast as far as like recovering shadows. So I totally agree. Exposing for your highlights, making sure that you're not overexposing the highlight, because that's the one thing that you can't fix in post unless you're cloning in fake highlights.
I think 10 years from now, people might be saying, what's HDR? Because the dynamic range of the sensors is just getting so great. I do have a tip for photographing landscapes. If someone said, what's the one tip? So I have something called my one picture promise. And the one picture promise is this, that if you're in a situation and you say to yourself, I can only take one picture, I promise that person, if they think about the picture, what lens, what exposure, what angle, should I use a tripod? Should I use a filter? If they think about all that stuff, if I can only take one picture, I promise them that they'll get a higher percentage of pictures, and it works all the time.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, you're just shooting what do we call it? Shooting a spraying and praying, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you think, a lot of people with the digital cameras, they don't have to think so much anymore. So I was at Thor's Well yesterday, and I said, okay, I'm only going to take one picture. And I've taken a lot of pictures of the well out to the ocean. I said, okay, I'm going to follow my own advice. So I got off to the side. I think Europe, if you go up to the left side and you get the coast down the right, Maybe you influence that subconsciously. I don't know, but I think that's an important thing. Think about that one picture. What would that picture be?
Yeah.
It'll save you a lot of time downloading too.
Photography in general is such a technical thing these days, especially, we're using these high-tech cameras and really fancy tripods and everything. And it's a very technically driven art for sure. Like as far as art forms go, it's probably the most technically driven. And because of that, I think people struggle to work backwards as far as like they envision what they're going for and then work backwards from there. A lot of people, they work forwards, meaning they start with their equipment. They start with their tripod and then they get out their camera and they click it on top of and then they have this big apparatus and then they're like, okay, I'm going to be creative now. And what I encourage people to do is to start off with the final result that you're going for and then work backwards. So you find that shot visually with your eyes, and then you figure out, okay, where do I need to get my camera to get that shot? And then you figure out where you need your camera. And then you're like, okay, so what settings do I need to create this envisioned photo that I have in my head? And then you figure out your settings, and then you realize, oh, I don't even need a tripod for those settings. Or you realize you do, and then you bust out the tripod. Working backwards from the end result rather than starting with equipment and then being creative after equipment, I think is something too.
Well, Ansel Adams was really big on that, right? The pre-visualization, he called it. So yeah, he envisioned what he could do in the darkroom, and I think that's really important. If the scene's not there, it looks flat, like we were at Strawberry Hill this morning, man, oh man, did it look flat. But, add a little clarity, adjust your levels, maybe some blacks, dehaze. If you envision the end result, that really helps you get the best possible in-camera image. And I think a lot of people today don't think about how can I get the best possible in-camera image, right? They just, the bracket. You probably never heard of this. Do you know what the BLH rule is?
Bracket like hell?
Yeah, bracket like hell. This is what we had to do with slide film. Oh, speaking of Ansel Adams, your listeners might enjoy the story. Our listeners have heard it before. John Sexton, he was one of Ansel Adams' assistants. Do you follow him at all? Great black and white photographer. One of the things that helps him get great images is that he talks to trees, but he has amazing pictures of trees, so it must work. So anyway, I'm teaching a workshop with John Sexton, and he's telling all these Ansel Adams stories. So he tells this Ansel Adams story, and I think it has to do with what we're talking about, what I was talking about at the beach today, right? This is before computers. This is back in the 70s. Someone on the East Coast writes Ansel Adams a letter. And this person is really unhappy with Ansel Adams. Could you imagine being unhappy with Ansel Adams? Says, "Dear Mr. Adams, I'm really unhappy." He says, "I have your posters. I have your books. I have one of your original prints. You inspired me to go to Yosemite. And when I got there, it didn't look like that." So it's a funny story, but Yosemite doesn't look like that, right? It looks kind of like that. And I think what you're talking about, Ansel Adams, he envisioned that end result. What can I do to bring out, talk about HDR. He was the first HDR photographer, an amazing HDR photographer, and he created these HDR, high dynamic range images in the wet dark room.
Right, and he was one of the first really heavy post processors too.
Yeah,
he spent so much time in the dark room doing a lot of the things that modern photographers are doing now, dodging and burning, and he was really one of the first people to do that. And that's also what really set him apart, because it was a whole lot of work to do that back then.
Well, him and Karsh of Ottawa, a great portrait photographer, he did the same thing. You've probably seen the picture of, and our listeners probably have seen it, of Hemingway in that sweater, and it looks like a silver print, like every detail in his beard, not as cool as your beard, but every detail in the beard. And Karsh would do the same thing. So getting back to these expressions, one of my favorites, another favorite is, you can't spend too much time working on a picture, because your soul is in the picture. Now, because sometimes on workshops, people say, "Oh, I'm spending too much time." If you love that picture, your soul is in the picture. Now, if you take a picture of your dog, a cat, a bird, your soul may not be in that picture. But if you really love a picture, spend the time on it. And someone asked about, how can I do something in Photoshop? Use Lightroom more than Photoshop?
I use Photoshop more than Lightroom, actually.
All right. Me, Dave Cross. When I was at Photoshop World teaching, myself and Dave Cross were the only two guys there who used Photoshop more than Lightroom. Yeah. So I'm so glad to hear that. But someone said, "Oh, I need to do this." I said, "Well, you could do it." And I said, "Did you ever hear the Stephen Wright joke?" You know Stephen Wright?
Oh, yeah.
Stephen, he has all these one-liners. And one of his one-liners is this: everything is within walking distance as long as you have time.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing in Photoshop. Everything's
Yep.
possible in Photoshop almost as long as you have time.
Yep.
So I encourage people, spend a lot of time going back. And speaking of that, we're working under fluorescent lights here, and some people on the workshops are like under stress and they're drinking coffee and having some rogue dead guys at night.
Yeah.
And all these things, believe it or not, stress, age, I'm older than you, stress, age, caffeine, and alcohol, they affect how we see color. So people working on their monitors at night, whether they're having happy hour or some coffee, working on the pictures, they may wake up the next day and say, what was I thinking? Right? Which happens to be
every day.
Every day. But anyway, that I think that's important to remember, that the color, you shouldn't be really. So my advice is, especially if you print, don't drink and print.
Don't drink and print. Great advice from the Godfather, Rick Sammon. But and when you're talking about spending a lot of time on a photo, one of the things that people should spend more time at, not only on each edit, but spend more time really culling through your work after a photo shoot. I think a lot of people, they get a little bit lazy when it comes to culling through and finding the very best composition that you took that particular day. You take all these photos, and if you don't take the time to find the perfect one or the best one, you're going to be spending all of that time on the wrong photo. So spend a little bit of extra time culling through and making sure that you're only spending that amount of time on your very best, rather than spending that amount of time on all of your B-list stuff.
Do you find this, getting back to the picture I took at Thor's Well yesterday, I was really happy with the shot. And if I didn't get that shot, I wasn't happy with any of the other shots. Does that ever happen to you?
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
there's just that one. And if that one wouldn't have happened, you wouldn't have got anything.
That's right. It's amazing. So I think it's really important to go through those shots and see what's your best, exposure-wise, composition-wise, mood-wise, feeling-wise, action-wise.
And it's something to keep in mind when you go out and you feel like you're just totally getting skunked on something, is you're only one photo away from it being a complete success. So it only takes that one photo from every shoot that you go to for it to be worth it and to be a good outing. So when you're feeling down on yourself, it's not always that you're not going to get anything. Maybe you just haven't got that interesting moment yet.
Well, speaking of that and being down, I was saying the other day on a workshop, sometimes it's like an up and down thing. You get a great shot, you feel really great. Then you go to the next location and everyone else got a great shot. You didn't get a great shot. Mm-hmm. So it's up and down. But I think that's part of the learning experience. The highs are high and the lows are lows.
Yep.
It's kind of like being on a roller coaster, right? But being on a roller coaster is way more fun than being on the merry-go-round, right? You just get the same stuff all the time. So I think that's part of the learning process. So what I'm trying to say, I think what Nick is trying to say to our listeners, you're not always going to go out and get the great shots. It's like playing golf. Yep. You may have a great. Do you play golf?
Yeah, I do. Actually.
Oh, so you get the great putt or the pin shot or whatever, from 50 yards away. You're so happy, but the next day you may go out and you may really suck, right?
Yep. It's those really bad rounds that make you appreciate the good rounds, and it's those really bad photography outings that make you appreciate when everything just goes right and a rainbow pops out over the top of your composition. It's you wouldn't appreciate that stuff if it happened every day, and it certainly does not happen every time you go out, and it makes you appreciate the good times.
Speaking of golf, I was taking golf lessons. And by the way, for our listeners who've never played golf is the only sport where the more lessons you take, the worse you could get. Nick's laughing because, right?
Yeah.
But my golf instructor gave me great advice, which applies to photography, I think. And the advice was, the first day she saw me swing, she said, I'm going to give you some good advice. I said, what's that? She said, slow down. And once I started slowing down and evening out my swing, I got a lot better. And I think in photography, people like you was talking before, they get down, they set up the tripods, they do this, and they got to get the shot. But if you slow down and again, think about that one picture and just breathe and, experience the moment rather than just, I got to get the shot.
Yeah. And part of that comes from people that only have a small window to do photography in, people that only get to do photography every so often, you put so much pressure on yourself to get good photos during that time that you feel pressured, you feel rushed. And then if you look over at the guy that gets to shoot every day, they're just walking around with their hands in their pockets. They don't even have their camera out yet. And the reason for that is they feel a lot more patient, because they don't put that pressure on them to get a good photo every time they go out. And how ironic is it that the person that doesn't get to do photography all the time feels more pressure than the person that does to get a good photo? And that's really unrealistic pressure we're putting on ourselves. You need to just kind of take a deep breath, relax. If you get a good photo, great. If you don't, it's not the end of the world. You'll get one next time or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like this was a good conversation, right?
Oh, it's always fun seeing you again. Thank you so much for presenting at our workshop. Our participants loved your work. I think you got some people for your Palouse and your Iceland workshops.
Well, I have so many workshops going on right now. I can't even keep them all straight. Doing a couple Faroe Islands next year that sold out. I got a lot going on. Kauai coming up soon.
That's cool.
I'm excited for. But anyways, thank you so much, Rick. And make sure for my listeners to go check out your podcast. Where can people find it?
PicturingSuccess.com. PicturingSuccess.com. And you?
Landscape Photography Podcast. And you can find them both on iTunes, on Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you listen to. Thank you, Rick. And we'll catch you guys next time. Bye-bye.